Welcome to the darkness, where every shadow hides a story. I'm the Doctor, and in this world, reality is just the beginning of the terror. Grab a seat, turn off the lights, and let's dive into tonight's tale of fear. Don't say I didn't warn you. The Black Vein. Hidden deep within the Appalachian Mountains lies a stretch of forest locals call the Hollow Vale. The name doesn't appear on maps, and you'd never find it unless you were looking for it. Or if it was looking for you. When Alex and his younger brother Ethan inherited their late uncle's remote cabin, they treated it as an excuse to escape the suffocating monotony of city life. The cabin was quaint but sturdy, its walls lined with rustic tools and faded photographs. However, it was the journal they found in the attic that caught their attention. It belonged to their uncle, a man they barely remembered. The entries were rambling, disjointed. They described something he called the Black Vein. It's not a place, it's alive. It hums under your skin, whispers in your blood. Once you see it, it never lets you go. The brothers dismissed the journal as the product of isolation-induced madness, but one passage stood out, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Whatever you do, don't follow the singing. They laughed it off. Superstitions had no place in their modern lives, or so they believed. The forest surrounding the cabin was vast and quiet, almost unnaturally so. Alex noticed it first. No birds chirped during the day, and at night, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. Instead, there was an oppressive silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. On their first night, Alex awoke to the faint sound of something distant. A faint, melodic hum carried on the wind. It was almost soothing, like a lullaby. He dismissed it as a trick of the mind and went back to sleep. The next morning, Ethan mentioned it. "Did you hear that last night?" he asked over breakfast, his voice tinged with unease. Alex shrugged. "Probably just the wind." But Ethan seemed unconvinced. By the third night, the sound had changed. What was once a faint hum became a clear melody, haunting and ethereal. It seemed to emanate from the forest itself, weaving through the trees and wrapping around the cabin like a shroud. Ethan couldn't resist its pull. He spent hours at the window, his eyes scanning the dark forest. "It's beautiful," he whispered one night. "It's unsettling," Alex shot back. "Close the window and stop listening to it." But Ethan didn't stop. The melody consumed him, filling his waking thoughts and haunting his dreams. He started muttering in his sleep, his words slurred and unintelligible. And then they found the root. While chopping firewood near the cabin, Alex struck the ground with his axe. Instead of dirt, he unearthed a thick black root that oozed a dark, viscous liquid. The substance smelled acrid, like burnt flesh, and the root pulsed faintly, as if it were alive. Ethan knelt to touch it, ignoring Alex's protests. The moment his fingers brushed the root, he recoiled, clutching his hand. "It's cold," he muttered, staring at his palm. A thin black line had appeared under his skin, snaking up toward his wrist. That night, Ethan's condition worsened. The black line spread like ink through his veins, and his skin grew pale and clammy. He claimed he could hear the song louder now, clearer, as if it were calling him by name. By morning, Ethan was gone. Alex tore through the forest, screaming Ethan's name until his voice cracked. His search stretched for hours, each step taking him deeper into the woods. And then he found the path. It was lined with the same black roots, now thicker and pulsating more aggressively. The song was deafening here, coming from everywhere at once. Alex hesitated at first, but desperation overruled caution, and he plunged down the path. As he walked, the forest seemed to close in around him. The trees grew taller and more gnarled, their branches forming an impenetrable canopy. The ground beneath his feet became soft and spongy, as if the forest were alive and breathing. Finally, the path opened into a clearing, and Alex froze. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its bark blackened and oozing with the same viscous liquid as the roots. The ground around it was slick and shiny, reflecting the faint moonlight. Ethan was there, kneeling at the base of the tree. "Ethan!" Alex called out, but his brother didn't respond. As Alex approached, he realized Ethan wasn't kneeling. He was fused to the tree, his body contorted unnaturally. Black veins crisscrossed his pale skin, and his eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at something Alex couldn't see. The tree groaned, its bark shifting like flesh. Faces emerged from the surface, twisted, agonized faces that opened their mouths in silent screams. One of the faces was Ethan's. "Run," it mouthed, though no sound escaped. The black liquid began to seep toward Alex, snaking across the ground like sentient tendrils. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The song was inside him now, vibrating through his bones. Visions flooded his mind, flashes of people being consumed by the tree, their faces joining the ever-growing tapestry of torment. He saw ancient rituals performed under blood-red moons, sacrifices made to appease the tree's insatiable hunger. The liquid reached his feet, and a searing cold shot through his body. He screamed as the blackness crawled up his legs, filling his veins with icy fire. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Ethan's face, tears streaming down his cheeks. Weeks later, hikers discovered the cabin, abandoned and eerily pristine. Inside, they found Alex's journal, its pages smeared with black fingerprints. The final entry read, "It's not just a tree, it's a doorway, and it's hungry." The hikers never made it out of the forest. Now locals speak of the hollow vale with hushed voices, warning travelers to avoid the area at all costs. They say the melody still lingers, faint and haunting, drawing in the curious and the lost. And if you venture too close, you might see the tree, its bark shifting to reveal the faces of those it has claimed, each one silently begging you to turn back. But by then it's already too late. Amelia lived a quiet life in the small, isolated town of Grey Hollow, nestled between dense woods and a jagged cliff that overlooked the sea. She was a librarian, and her days were spent surrounded by the whispers of old pages and the occasional laughter of children who came to borrow fairy tales. But lately, something had changed. People were vanishing, not physically, but in a way far more sinister. It began subtly. First, a neighbor no one could recall ever having met. Then, a shopkeeper who'd been there for years, but whose face blurred in memory. Conversations shifted as people grasped for names and details that refused to come. And then it happened to Amelia. One rainy evening, she sat at her desk, cataloging books. The storm outside roared against the library's tall windows, casting erratic shadows across the room. She pulled a pen from her pocket and began to sign off on a ledger, but froze mid-stroke. Her hand trembled as she stared at the blank line where her name should go. She couldn't remember it. Panicked, she flipped open her wallet, hoping to see her driver's license or any form of identification. But her cards were blank. The space where her name should have been was empty, as if it had never existed. The harder she tried to remember, the more her head throbbed. Memories of her childhood, her parents, and even her voice saying her own name blurred like watercolors, bleeding together. She glanced around the library, suddenly feeling watched. The storm outside had grown quieter, too quiet, and the air inside seemed heavier, pressing against her chest. That's when she noticed the figure standing between the shelves. The figure was tall and thin, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the shadows. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, as if studying her. Though it had no discernible features, Amelia felt its gaze pierce through her. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its movements jerky, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. The lights above flickered as it approached, and Amelia's breath hitched as she realized she could hear something. Soft, murmuring voices, that seemed to echo in her mind. They were whispering her name, or rather, what her name used to be. Each time the whispers grew louder, her memory of it slipped further away. The next morning, Amelia tried to speak to the townsfolk, desperate for answers. But something was wrong. The streets were eerily silent, and the few people she encountered seemed distant. Their eyes glazed over. When she asked about the missing names, they responded with confusion, as if the question itself didn't make sense. "Names don't matter," an old man mumbled, staring blankly at the cobblestones beneath his feet. "Not anymore." Amelia pressed him further, but he shook his head violently, his hands clutching his ears. "Don't ask. It hears you when you ask." That night she locked herself in her apartment, but sleep eluded her. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside her window made her jump. And then, at 3:33 a.m., she heard it. The faint sound of someone whispering outside her door. She didn't open the door. She didn't dare. Instead, she peeked through the peephole and saw the same figure from the library standing in the hallway. It didn't knock or try to force its way in. It simply stood there, waiting. Amelia backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, filling the apartment, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. "Give it back!" the voices demanded, blending into one guttural growl. "Give what back?" Amelia cried out, her voice cracking. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence. Then a single bone-chilling voice replied, "Your name." Determined to end the nightmare, Amelia returned to the library, believing the answer lay somewhere in the forgotten archives. She pored over ancient texts and crumbling manuscripts until her fingers were stained with dust and ink. Finally, she found a reference to an old town legend, the Nameless One. According to the story, the Nameless One was a creature born of forgotten memories and discarded identities. It thrived on names, stealing them to sustain its existence. Once it claimed a name, that person ceased to exist in the minds of others, their life unraveling until they too were consumed. The only way to stop it, the text claimed, was to reclaim your name by speaking it aloud in its presence. But there was a catch. If you failed to remember your name, you would belong to it forever. Armed with this knowledge, Amelia prepared herself. She lit candles around the library and opened every window, letting the stormy night air whip through the room. The Nameless One would come. She knew that much, and it did. The shadows seemed to coalesce into its form, pulling it from the corners of the library like smoke drawn to a flame. It stood before her, silent but expectant. Amelia clenched her fists, forcing herself to remember. Images of her childhood flashed through her mind, fragments of laughter and sunlight. But the harder she tried to grasp her name, the more elusive it became. The whispers began again, louder this time, drowning out her thoughts. The Nameless One stretched out a skeletal hand, its fingers curling toward her as if inviting her to give up. "No," she screamed. "You won't take me." With a surge of defiance, Amelia closed her eyes and let go of the fear. The memory came flooding back. A birthday card signed in neat cursive, a mother's voice calling her in for dinner. "Amelia!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the whispers. The Nameless One froze, its form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers turned into a wail, a sound of utter rage and despair, as the creature dissolved into the shadows. The town slowly returned to normal, but Amelia knew the Nameless One wasn't truly gone. It was a part of Grey Hollow, lurking in the forgotten corners, waiting for the next soul to forget their name. She became the town's guardian of sorts, teaching children to cherish their names, to write them down, to speak them proudly. But every so often on stormy nights, she could still hear the faintest whisper in the wind. Amelia, until next time, sleep tight.